following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners on Saga 960 AM and those listening around the world on streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems, using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. And you may notice I'm feeling more energetic this episode. I'm finally starting to feel about 70% human after getting COVID, and this episode, we're talking empathy. Award-winning Peel Region teacher Jason Bradshaw is back for the interview later. You may remember Jason was the guest on the very first show of It's Not Therapy. And this episode, Jason is going to be talking empathy for teachers as the school year starts up. But first, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, superheroes. Specifically, She-Hulk. A new She-Hulk show premiered on Disney Plus last week, I think, and it included a satirical section on dialectical behavior therapy, which I am a big proponent of, but still, the way they took it apart was pretty funny. Very funny. But that wasn't what a particular subsection of fans took from that part of the show. Oh, no. Certain guys took pretty serious issue with the fact that Jen Walters, played by Tatiana Maslany, went on a rant about the constant repressed anger that many women experience practically all the time. Instead of thinking, oh, that's what some women go through, the reaction was, this is heavy-handed, it's woke. In 2022, yes, it still staggers some men to learn that anger, sometimes constant anger, is a part of some women's experience. Now, to say something is part of an experience isn't saying it's right or wrong. It's just saying that it is. But some people have an incredibly hard time relating to the experiences of people who have, well, different experiences. Now, this is not to say that these people are inherently bad people. They may be extremely abused people. Abuse, among so many other things, separates people from their empathy. But it also could be that they have a lot of one type of empathy, but not enough of another type. Did you know that there are different types of empathy? There are. Now, it's up for debate just how many types. It's somewhere between 2 and 4. Everyone agrees on 2. Cognitive empathy, also known as perspective taking, and emotional empathy, also known as feeling another person's feelings. Now, some say that combining cognitive empathy and emotional empathy results in compassionate empathy, which is defined in a bunch of different ways. My use of compassionate empathy is being able to feel another person's feelings without losing your boundaries and getting overwhelmed by the other person's feelings. Now, other people break down the concept of compassionate empathy into staying out of judgment and communicating understanding, giving you a different third and a completely different fourth type. If you're at all interested, it's my show, I assume you are. I don't buy into complete non-judgment. I'm going to devote a future show to that, but we judge. That's why we have judgment. The goal is to not judge too quickly or harshly. And that's where the other types of empathy come in. Some people feel other people's feelings so acutely that they can't handle it. They get overwhelmed and they run away from the intense experience, or they feel the need to control things so tightly that they become abusive. Again, to stop the overwhelm. Other people completely understand another person's position and experience. They just don't care. I had to suck it up, so deal with it. That understands a struggle, but it's separated from how painful the experience was and is. Compassionate empathy is a balance between these two extremes. You have enough distance to stay on an even keel, but you're still connecting to people on an emotional level. Now, obviously, this requires a certain level of boundaries and judgment to stay in that stable middle. And admittedly, it's more art than science. But there are things you can do to increase your odds of success, whereas most of my top 10 phrases come from, but most notably, listen twice before you talk once. You can't understand where a person is coming from if you're not really hearing them. You might think you understand where that other person is coming from, but you don't actually understand where the other person is coming from until that other person confirms that you get what they're telling you. So make sure that you have that confirmation before proceeding. Now, another big part of empathy is self-acceptance, which is why I say self-esteem can't exist without self-compassion. If you can't live with your own feelings, you're not going to be able to handle the feelings of someone else as well. Compassion for other people starts with compassion for yourself. Now, that's what I think some not great therapists are really saying when they say don't judge. But again, more on that another week. A lot of people think that capacity for empathy is innate. And to an extent, that may be true, but it's overstated. We know that humans possess this thing called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are basically the reason that guys wince when they see another guy get kneed in the junk. I feel your pain is often very real for humans. But sociopaths, otherwise known as people with antisocial personality disorder, have a very weak response in that regard. Antisocial personalities just don't care if they hurt people, and they lack impulse control. Doctors aren't sure whether antisocial personality disorder is inherited or caused from a profound lack of nurturing from sociopathic parents. And you might be thinking of another condition, which is also a problem for empathy, but different from antisocial personality disorder. I'm talking about narcissistic personality disorder. Unlike sociopaths, the narcissist, the clinical narcissist, has an overwhelming need for attention and internally experiences a profound loneliness and shame and sensitivity to criticism, which explains so much premium cable and streaming television these days. A lot of that is made by narcissists. Now, we can compare and contrast. Narcissists are much less likely to experience trouble with the law. Narcissists are often better manipulators because a narcissist understands more than a sociopath what makes people tick, which is a form of empathy, that perspective taking, right? Narcissists just wrap that lonely emptiness inside them with a fragile shell of, I am the greatest. And if that shell gets cracked, a narcissist will hurt anyone they blame for the pain. And if they're not around, they'll blame those they don't blame, but who are convenient targets. If you watch the show The Boys, Black Noir is an example of antisocial personality disorder. An extreme example of antisocial personality disorder, but nonetheless an example. Whereas Homelander is an example of narcissistic personality disorder, both cultivated by a lack of nurturing, but one has the scary emptiness. The other one has the grandiose need for attention and approval. Either way, those are some people who profoundly lack empathy. And they're not going to change just because you show them some caring. Because at their core, they really don't care that you care. On the flip side, a huge stigma against people on the autism spectrum is that they lack empathy. But some of the most caring people I know have autism spectrum disorder. It may take them sometimes a bit longer to recognize and understand how other people are feeling. But once they get it, they care very much. And they're some of the most supportive people I know. And that, to me, is evidence that a big part of empathy is learned. It's modeled. Which means for most people, it's never too late to learn. And if you've gone through some terrible things yourself, you can draw from that to enhance your empathy. Now, I'm living proof. Traumatic childhood time. Okay, strap in, kiddies. I grew up in an abusive home. I'm okay with that now. It just is. My father used to scream at me with a shocking degree of regularity. You have to learn to control your emotions. By the time I was 6. Yeah, the irony of an adult screaming at a 6-year-old about emotional control is not lost on me. And yeah, I said it was regular by the time I was 6. Which means it actually started when I was younger than that. I had a parent that expected emotional control from a 4-year-old. For the record, a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old cannot be expected to have emotional control because a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old are not self-actualized, which is a requirement for healthy emotional processing. And I need to say this because I'm not the only one who grew up in an environment like this. My father was an example of someone who was easily overwhelmed by the emotions of others. He had a hair trigger, a very low threshold, and exploded from overwhelm. He was ill. But that didn't excuse what he did. And I hated him for it at one point, but I've since grown to have empathy for him, while still thinking that what he did was extremely wrong. That's right. I can have empathy and still think that, on the whole, he was a terrible person. So where did I learn my ability to not be overwhelmed by the emotions of others? How did I stop becoming like my father? School teachers. From the first grade onward, I had an above average sample of truly excellent teachers that counteracted my father's example. They weathered childish nonsense from students with good humor. It was teachers that taught me how to recognize personal limitations and manage them for personal growth. It was teachers who taught me that struggles aren't weakness. And it was teachers who taught me that you can have empathy for people going through a hard time without getting dragged down with them. And that was more important than any math, science, or grammar that I learned in school. Though I still love science, enjoy algebra, and have a begrudging respect for grammar. So that's why I wanted a teacher on this episode. So when we come back, the interview with Jason Bradshaw, award-winning Peel Regional teacher, to talk about the supports teachers need as students head back to school. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. It's time once again for the It's Not Therapy interview, and I'm super excited. We're talking empathy this week, but I have a guest I absolutely love. I've got Jason Bradshaw back. You may remember Jason from the very first episode of It's Not Therapy. He's a Peel Region award-winning science teacher, and Jason is here to talk about assumptions, empathy, and expectations as your kids go back to school. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, so this is going to be a unique year, to say the least, right? It's the first year back in person after the whole COVID hybrid remote. I mean, you guys have just been sort of, go along to get along for 2 years. And there's this expectation that there's going to be a more normal year this year. I keep hearing back to normal. Is this a reasonable expectation?
Well, I think we need to really think about what we mean by normal, and
Mm-hmm.
it began even last year. I think that around March break was really kind of the tipping point,
Mm-hmm.
where if you recall, like just after March break, that's when most of the COVID protocols and mandates ended in Ontario. There was no more mandatory masking in schools, and no more we used to have an app where we had to like check off our symptoms and make sure we were symptom free.
Mm-hmm.
All of that ended in March, and I think for a lot of people in their mind, that's when the pandemic ended and school was back to normal, so to speak. But it still hasn't gotten back to what I would call pre-pandemic normal, and it's still not going to be this year, I don't think, because we still have COVID, and we still have issues of teachers not having enough teachers to fill classes because people are still getting sick with COVID. They still have
Mm-hmm.
family at home who they're taking care of with COVID, and many other issues that still haven't been resolved. So I think that although it may look a bit more normal in some ways, and it began to look more normal even last year, we still have we still need to have reasonable expectations that things are not going to be quite like what they were pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And to me, reasonable is, I did a whole episode on reasonableness because of this. I've been sort of stacking episodes, one building on the other, because I'm seeing a lot of really unreasonable expectations of others as people sort of struggle for control, that need to return to normalcy. And it's the exact opposite of empathy. They're offloading it onto teachers, nurses, frontline workers, right? Like, just do your job so we don't have to think about it anymore, right? You've
Mm-hmm.
been you've been getting some of that online. I've seen the weird stuff you get on Twitter, and this is part of the reason I wanted to have you back. Um, what what sort of things have you been encountering that way, just so people can sort of understand what teachers are going through?
Well, I think you touched on an important point, and I understand that people want the pandemic to be over. They want things to be back to normal. And I think that they lash out a little bit when
Mm-hmm.
they are reminded that maybe things aren't quite there yet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very normal, I think, human reaction to just want to be able to look away from things that remind you of things that upset you. So, for example, when we look at wearing masks in school, there's been a huge, a lot of controversy about should the mask mandates be brought back? Should they have been lifted in the first place? Like, how do we deal with this? Should
Mm-hmm.
teachers wear masks and whatnot? And a lot of people are adamantly against the idea of having masks in school, and not even just like a mask mandate. They don't want to see masks in school because I think
Mm-hmm.
to them it's a reminder that we still haven't fully gone back to normal. And I would say that at least a reasonable middle ground would be if people want to wear masks, they shouldn't be obviously, harassed
Mm-hmm.
or made fun of or made to feel like they're living in fear, so to speak, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what they want to do to feel safe and comfortable. Basically, what somebody else chooses to do is none of your business, but people make it their business because they don't want to see that reminder. And I think that ultimately people they want they expect schools to do so much for their children.
Mm-hmm.
It's a place to learn. It's a place for them to have mental health supports, for them to develop socially, and that's all good. That is what school does. But I think that for a lot of people, all they really look at is if I can drop my kid off in the morning and pick them up at the end of the day, that means everything's a okay and everything's back to normal. but that's completely putting one's head in the sand and not maybe thinking about the things that are happening in school that that are still lacking and that we still need. It takes a village to raise a child, as they say. It can't just all be put on teachers to raise children.
Yeah, there has to be a coordination between the parents and the teachers so everybody's on the same page, right?
Yes, absolutely, and I think that most parents and most families understand that. I
Mhm.
feel that sometimes maybe we do focus on the negative, especially when we look at conversations on Twitter.
Yeah.
But in real life, the vast majority of parents and families that I have worked with have been absolutely supportive of educators, and they understand that we're all part of a team where everyone wants what is best for children. And I think it's really just a vocal minority of people who really want to turn it into like a parents versus teacher kind of thing where teachers are just greedy and complaining, and you know
Hmm.
they're using kids as pawns and as weapons, and that is like the most ridiculous like take that I think someone could have. Nobody goes into education to use kids and to exploit kids. I mean, it's the opposite of what we do, right?
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I have an experience from my own teenage years. It was grade 10. It was science. And the teacher made a comment that hurt my feelings. And I went home, and in retrospect, I did the worst thing I could possibly do. I told my father, and he blew up, and he went into the school and he yelled at the teacher, and I had to go into class the next day. And I was so embarrassed. And so I sort of see this from the kids' point of view. And I think there are some parents who think that a strong offense is the best way to advocate for their kid, but it's not. Right? I can tell you
Mm.
from the kid's point of view, I imagine it's not fun for the teacher. It's not productive to create an adversarial relationship with your child's teacher. What does work? If a parent has a concern, what's the best way to express it?
Honestly, just speaking to the teacher, like not confronting them or
Mhm.
being aggressive about it. Um, like 99% of the time, if a teacher says or does something that is upsetting to a child, it was probably unintentional.
Yes.
And we're human. We make mistakes. We say or we do things, and we kick ourselves and we say, "Oh, I that was bad. I know I shouldn't have done that." And obviously, the right thing to do on the teacher's part would be to reach out and try to mend that damage ourselves as
Mhm.
well. But at the same time, I think you have to assume good intentions,
Yeah.
and that's a dangerous thing to say as well, because oftentimes that can be used as a an excuse for something truly awful, right? We have to
Right.
look at impact and intent, right? So even the best intentions don't excuse a negative impact. But at the same time, coming in all guns blazing and coming in on the attack is like, again, we're all human beings, and
Mhm.
when somebody comes at you, your response is going to be to come back at them. And
Right.
now you have this conflict when, in all likelihood, all parties involved all just want what's best for the kid. So if you
Right.
could come at it from that approach of just coming to a teacher or someone in the school and saying, this happened, this is how my child feels about it, this was hurtful, um, how can we make this right?
Right. Right. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember the teacher, he didn't really say, like, I knew it had happened. And I went in the next day. I was really nervous, and he treated me like everybody else. And that meant something to me. And we're meant to go to a break right now. So we're going to pause. When we come back on It's Not Therapy, more with award-winning Peel Region teacher Jason Bradshaw after the break. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana. I'm still not a therapist, and we are still talking to Jason Bradshaw, award-winning Peel Region science teacher, about empathy for teachers and working with teachers over the school year as your students go back this fall. Like you said, everybody has the best interests of the kids, the teens, in mind right now. But everything seems so high stakes. And how do you, as a teacher, get that mess on Twitter and get these things said to you? How do you shake it off and not pass it on to the students?
Well, honestly, the students themselves are the best medicine because so much positivity comes from them. And I've said before that sometimes I will get like a nasty message or a nasty tweet directed at me, and people do ask me like, how do you brush this off? Like, how do you just kind of like discard it and like not be upset over it? And then I show them some of the letters and the cards that students have given me, and the gratitude and just the wonderful things that they say and the jokes that they tell and like the exchanges and interactions that we have. And one positive interaction like that from a student who appreciates the work that I do completely just overshadows 100 negative comments. It is just there's no comparing it. So it is just the negative is just such a small thing compared to the positive. So ultimately, I just think of who am I working for, and it's the students. It's not these angry people on Twitter who are going to say I pay my taxes, so I pay your salary. You owe me this. I remember one person on Twitter saying that his problem with teachers was that we're not grateful enough for our jobs. We don't show taxpayers enough gratitude. And I was like, what? Like I owe you gratitude for a career that I have worked so hard and for something that I've worked my whole life to achieve and that every day I'm working my hardest at to help kids. Like I owe you gratitude. So it's just a bizarre take that people have, and when you really think about it, I can't take it seriously. So it just doesn't bother me that much.
The word work, I think, is really, really important. And I don't want to ignore something you said earlier. So I'm going to circle back a bit, but also tie in that teaching is work. And I think because it's a nurturing profession, people often lose sight of that. So what is that stuff as an empathy exercise? What is that stuff that happens from the time a parent drops their kid off in the morning to when they pick them up after school? What do you think people are missing that they should know?
I think they're missing the idea that school is about teaching kids and it's not just about teaching curriculum. Because a very common, again, criticism that people bring up is that it's my job to just be teaching kids how to read, write, or do math, or more specifically, in my case, teach them science, and that other things are none of my business. And dealing with students' personal problems, affirming their identities, creating a safe space for them where they feel safe and comfortable expressing themselves. None of that is the job of a teacher. That's all up to the parents. But again, it's a communal effort, and when people just dismiss school as a place where kids go to just be drilled in math and science and reading and writing, I guess it's easy to understand why they would think that all that matters is that they drop their kids off and pick them up, and maybe they get some extracurriculars along the way. So it makes it very easy to dismiss what teachers do and to diminish it. But when you think of teachers as people who are doing our best to support the overall growth and wellness of young people, then hopefully that would allow people to maybe have a little bit more empathy in regards to what we do. And there's definitely this sense of expecting teachers and other professionals like nurses as well to be martyrs, so to speak. And if we do raise any issues or concerns about our workplace, about our environment, then it becomes, oh, but I thought you're supposed to be doing it for the kids. Like, what do you mean that you need more funding or whatnot? I mean, you're doing it for the kids. You should be happy with what you have. And the same thing happens with nurses, as there's
Mm-hmm.
concerns about cuts in healthcare. And I think we have to be honest and realize that both of these are typically female dominated professions. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a bit of misogyny there, and that it's kind of just you know, women are meant to just kind of be giving and to sacrifice and to be martyrs. But
Mm-hmm.
we're professionals. We're highly trained. We're highly educated, and we put a lot of work into what we do. So of course we expect to be treated as professionals and to be given the accommodations of professionals.
It's funny because when you say people think you should just stick to teaching science, I remember some of the best lessons I learned from my math and science teachers, because they are, you can't BS a chemistry test the same way you can BS an essay, right? One of the things I
Mm-hmm.
learned is how to handle when you are struggling with something and you're not at your best. One of the greatest lessons was, no, say something. Don't just write the test and bomb it. And if that happened to be my enriched math teacher. It's enriched math, right? You think it's the
Mm-hmm.
nerdiest of the nerds, but that was one of the best lessons I took away. And that makes me think, if they actually want you to just stick to science, what do they expect you to do? Just ignore when a kid is struggling? Just say, too bad, what's the atomic weight of boron? What do you think the expectation actually is of people who go there?
Well, one of the most, and I think we've touched upon this before when we
Mhm.
spoke about students' mental health.
Mhm.
One of the most bizarre approaches that people have is that school should be like the sink or swim environment,
Yeah.
where they, like, people literally complain if not enough kids are failing in school. That means the expectations aren't high enough. There should be more failures. There should be too many kids are getting A's and things like that. And okay, that's a bizarre way to think about it. I mean, wouldn't it be better to think that kids are being more successful because they're given more opportunities to be successful?
Mhm.
And I use the analogy of riding a bicycle and the fact that it doesn't matter how many times you fall down when you learn to ride a bicycle. All that matters is at the end, you know how to ride that bicycle, right? But
Right.
to some people, they would say, if there was a class on riding a bicycle, they would say, oh, this child fell down 6 times. You know what? They get a D in the course. It's like, okay, but can they ride a bicycle at the end? Because if
Yeah.
they can, why don't they deserve an A? Like, the process is a process,
Right.
and we and as adults we know this. We know that we learn and we're given leeway to make mistakes and have accommodations. But why do we expect children to be penalized and to be graded on everything they do as soon as they step in the classroom?
Yeah, that's teaching teens at the point where their individual identities are forming. And oh God, I said identity, everybody's gonna freak out on me now. But that's just basic adolescent development, right? Between the ages of, say, 13 and 18, that's where a lot of that individuation happens. And one of the important things of high school is you are setting the tone for the rest of a young person's life in terms of their expectations on the world. And there's a difference between parenting and mentoring, right? And
Mm-hmm.
teachers are mentors first and foremost. I know I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, but what's something a mentor can do to support a parent that, you know, this is actually helping a parent? So let teachers don't just teach, but mentor. Where's that role of mentorship come in?
That's a difficult question, but
Yeah,
I
it
think
is.
while we're on the topic of identities and
Mhm.
affirming identities and development of young people, oftentimes a young person may not feel comfortable discussing certain aspects of that development and of their identities with a parent. And that is where, as you say, the mentorship role is a really powerful one, because
Mhm.
ultimately, what a mentor and what a teacher should be is a caring adult who doesn't have the same familial ties to a person.
Mm-hmm.
So ideally, that makes us a safe adult who kids can come to. And then we can provide support as that young person maybe needs to speak to their family about larger issues. So I think, in a way, the role of a mentor, the way that's different than a parent, is that we can offer that support, we can offer that compassion, but we also have just enough space that we're not invested in quite the same level as a family member would be. So obviously, that does give us a little bit more of a perspective and maybe a bit of a more objective way to support people.
Yeah, and I guess getting rejected by a teacher for a teen is one thing. Getting rejected by a parent is crushing. And so using a teacher as something as a dry run, I imagine happens quite a bit. Am I wrong?
No, you're correct, and
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, a student has a lot of teachers in their lives, and hopefully, they have a lot
Mm-hmm.
of good, supportive ones. But family, of course, is a different thing. You don't necessarily get more than one set of parents, if that, if
Yeah.
you're lucky, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And you're so much more dependent on your family as a teen than you are as a teacher. So if it goes bad with the teacher, like you said, there are other teachers, but you only have one family.
Yes.
All right, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time and your wisdom as well. I don't know, what is the appropriate wish for a teacher starting off on a new school year? Like, so long and thanks for all the fish. I don't know what's appropriate here.
Wish us good sleep and good health.
All right, I am good sleep and good health. Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you.
Time for our final break. When we come back, final words, at least for this episode, on empathy. Stay with us. It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back, wrapping up on It's Not Therapy on empathy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. And I want to go back to that thing I talked about off the top about some guys losing it over She-Hulk saying, in her own words, unkind but true things about anger in women. The resentment, among some, seemed to come from the idea that the show itself was endorsing Tatiana Maslany's character's view on her own experience. And that is messed up. Not because some people feel that way, but because so much media trains us to think that if the hero or heroine on a show says something, it must automatically be universal instead of just true for them. And that defeats the entire purpose of examples of perspective taking in media. Perspective taking, of course, being one of the forms of empathy that we're talking about on this episode. The innovative thing, well, one of the innovative things that Marvel Comics did, nerd time, back in the days of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, John Romita, Steve Ditko, and others, was creating a new kind of villain. One that wasn't completely evil. Often, most of the time actually, Marvel villains back in the Stan Lee days were mentally ill, desperate, or both, as opposed to thoroughly bad people. And even a lot of Marvel Comics heroes struggle with mental illness. That's why the dialectical behavioral therapy scene in She-Hulk was so funny for me. Because Bruce Banner, the guy that turns into the Hulk, has dissociative identity disorder stemming from a horrific childhood. Yes, that's the same condition as Moon Knight has. Also an awesome show. But back to She-Hulk. The She-Hulk scene that caused so many people to lose their stuff was actually an excellent example of perspective taking, that base form of empathy. Neither Bruce, the Hulk, or Jen, the She-Hulk, is totally in the right in that scene. But both are speaking truths, their truths. Bruce Banner is coming into the scene years into his journey facing his demons, whereas Jen is only at the beginning of hers. And Jen exhibits 3 of the 5 stages of grief in that scene: denial, anger, and bargaining, in a very short period of time. Healing involves a lot of grieving. And if people are denied one of those stages of grief, anger, they can't properly grieve. And yet anger is the emotion society shuts down precisely because it's so overwhelming. No one likes being yelled at. But it's much harder to handle being yelled at when you can't admit to yourself that you don't like being yelled at. To me, having been in Smart Hulk's purple shorts in that scene, yes, nerds, his shorts weren't actually purple there. I'm appealing to normies. Please chill out. Anyway, having been on the receiving end of people's anger that's not about me, a lot, for a living, the perspective I most immediately took in that scene between Hulk and She-Hulk was Hulk's. So the whole color-coded dialectical behavior therapy binder, that was hilarious to me because, yeah, I've been a true believer in that stuff myself. So I could laugh at myself, even as I saw myself represented in Bruce Banner there. But I also related to Jen, who's at the beginning of her journey. I remember that, how she lashed out, how she insisted she was in control, to quote Animal and the Muppets, even when she clearly wasn't. How every cruel thing she said was undermined by her behavior, even though she believed those things to be true. But that, and I'm speculating here, that's what I think some people missed. Those people lashed out against Jen because they are Jen. They're controlled by their anger and fear because of a misguided sense that their anger and fear are controllable. And they're really not, by design. Anger and fear are defense mechanisms designed for crisis situations. They're not things you're supposed to feel all the time. And yet so many people do. And that's the thing. Anger and fear disconnect us from our empathy precisely because they're worst case scenario survival mechanisms. So if you're walking around angry and afraid a lot, if you're walking around angry and afraid most of the time, you're not connecting to other people. And you deserve better. It's impossible to take the perspective of anyone else when you're in those states. Your brain is just not set up to do that. So my theory, and it may be crackpot, is that the guys who lost it over She-Hulk because She-Hulk was angry aren't necessarily misogynists. They're guys that are too much like her, so they can't see themselves in her. And that's how empathy overwhelm gets us. Because when you're in a more neutral place, you see how not great Jen Walters comes across in that scene. Right down to the non-apology she attempts to pull and gets called on by Smart Hulk. Too many guys, too many everyone, need women to be more together than them because they're drowning. And they've been taught that other men will just bully them for that, like Homelander on The Boys. So when they face the suggestion that women are not more together than men, freak out! They miss it. They just lose it. Just, oh my God, too heavy-handed, woke, preaching. No. And much like Jen Walter's perspective in the show, it's not a bad thing. It just is. So what's the moral of the story? For me, it's be the hero of your own story. In other words, in this context, be more like Smart Hulk than She-Hulk. Let other people have their feelings. Connect to them. But don't be overwhelmed by them. Smart Hulk doesn't have to be right. Smart Hulk doesn't have to be dominant. Smart Hulk doesn't have to smash. Hey guys, I'm a mental health type. Did you expect me to have any other takeaway here? And at least we've got Marvel for this, because the other big Disney, not Disney property, Star Wars, is not getting the benefit of the light side of the Force lately overall. The light side of the Force may seem less powerful in the short term because light side Jedi aren't letting the hate flow through them. But light side Jedi are the masters of winning the war by being willing to lose a few battles. You don't have to win all of the time. What you have to do is walk away with or develop that sense of who you are as an individual. And that's what Smart Hulk understands, because he's been on the other side of therapy that changes the stories he tells himself about himself. Every single one of us has the power to control our own personal narrative. We can't control our emotions. We can't control the actions of others. What we can do is control what we tell ourselves stuff means. And I'm out of time. Next week, we're going to talk judgments, how to make good ones, how to avoid bad ones, and I want your questions. So give me a call, 289-275-9600. Leave a message or preferred email. Email me at Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Lian as in Nancy A at nottherapyshow.com. Or Not Therapy Show on Twitter and Instagram. And real quick, Saga 960 AM is supporting the Terry Fox Run, September 18th, terryfox.org/run. You're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Bye-bye.